All right, welcome to Gateway API meeting for January 22. Looks like we've got a fairly light group today, but that should be great because I think we've got some good items to discuss, including Grant added something about session persistence here, which I expect will take some part of the discussion. Um, Gaurav also has an item, yeah, a few different things here. Um, yeah, before I go any further, just a reminder, this is a official Kubernetes community meeting. That means we abide by the Kubernetes Code of Conduct. In general, that just means be nice to each other. Also recommend if you have anything to say, using Zoom's raise hand feature just so that we can ensure that we get to everyone that wants to say something. And with that, let me jump right in.
I think
Gaurav, thank you. You've added
is
a
there.
gateway cuddle gep. Sorry, I'll get my language right one of these days. And I'm wondering if you can provide just a high level overview of what this is doing.
Yeah, sure. So as we were discussing in, I think, one of the previous meetings, we wanted to kind of document and make sure what is our overall plan with Gateway Cuddle, at least in the initial phases. What is the motivation behind it, and what are the initial set of problems that we want to solve? So this GEP is one of those memorandum GEPs where we're trying to clarify the main initial set of features or the initial set of problems that are motivating us to build this thing, and what's a minimal viable product for Gateway Cuddle will look like. So if you have not gone through the gap, please, whenever you get a chance, to take a look. It's pretty simple. And uh, yeah, what else can we cover over here without taking a long time?
Yeah, I
Motivations.
think one of the things I've only looked at this at a high level, but one of the things I found particularly interesting is that you've gone to the trouble of adding a lot of information in terms of the scope of this project and particularly different commands and what you expect they would output. I think this is kind of a good exercise for anyone interested in the project to spend some time looking at this and confirming, hey, is this the output I really expected to see here? Is this, is this something
Yep.
that I would rather have operate differently? There's a lot of really, really useful stuff here. So just that's what I'd really direct people's attention to. And then also at the top, you've got these goals that are well defined. And yeah, I think these are the things that really could benefit from review. I've got that on my own list, but certainly would benefit from others taking a look as well. Um,
Yeah, I just found the deploy preview was a little complicated, so I put the deploy preview in the chat, Rob.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Yeah. So I think some of the things that you put in there, Gaurav, I'll put some comments about the formatting because I feel like the having to expand the things kind of is not
Yeah,
cool.
I wasn't expecting this exactly. I was expecting.
Yeah. So yeah, that's why the deploy preview is always useful. Yeah. I'll have a look at the deploy preview and give you a review later today. But
Got it.
I really like
Cool.
the overall sort of format. I think that having a gateway kettle is good, and I think as long as we sort of put in there that we've thought about things like, where does this live and how does this get released and stuff like that is sort of the main things that I want this to handle is like,
Got it.
Yeah.
like why have we put it in this repo for now, and like what are we planning on doing about that in the future? Is sort of important things to have in here. But yeah, I'll give this a proper review later.
Got it. I think some of those questions which you just spoke about, I haven't actually included them in the GEP, but I guess it makes sense to include them. So I will go ahead and modify the GEP with some of those particular questions, which
Yeah,
at
you
least
and
I
I have chatted
can.
offline
Yeah,
about it already, so yeah, you know what to put. Yeah,
I'll do that. Sure. Thanks a
yeah,
lot.
great, thanks.
Um, yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks, Gaurav. Um, Yeah, next up, a couple from me. One is just I've put in this is kind of a follow-up from discussion in previous meetings as well about listening TLS validation. This is the actual implementation of that. As you can tell, it's actually a fairly large change that addresses three different related things. One of them goes back in time to when we had numbers in the three digits for issues and goes back a ways. Wow, we're almost at 3 years old now. Anyway, yeah, it's been a while. So this is the TLS self-service TLS, which we said, oh, we absolutely need to enable this in the API, and we'll document how it could work, and we never did. And I think that's all very related to this change. So as part of loosening the validation, we're allowing things like a model that would enable other third-party controllers, automation, whatever, to attach certificates in some other way or the same way just after the user initially configures a gateway, for example. So this tries to lay out a pattern for how that could work, or a few different examples of how that could work. And at the same time, it also adds documentation for what listener isolation means in the context of Gateway TLS. There's a lot in here. So really, really appreciate some review. I appreciate that Eitan, I think, reviewed this already, and I need to respond to his comments here. He actually had a similar issue asking about self-service TLS in the API, and so it's good to see his feedback here. Yeah, so that's this. This does propose adding one additional reason just because it felt like, well, you got to have an additional reason if you're adding another thing that could potentially be invalid. But there's a good point that we already have a pretty generic catch-all invalid reason, and so maybe having a reason that's purely a subset of that doesn't make sense. So feedback, welcome on that. And with that, Nick, you've got some thoughts?
Yeah, so for that specific one, I actually think having more specific reasons is probably good as long as they're justified, and I think in this case they are. But yeah, more generically, one of the biggest changes about this is that I know for me and all the controllers I've worked on, one of the assumptions we make is that if you have a TLS stanza set, that means you have to have a certificate ref set, and that means that you want TLS. So one of the big changes is that this implies is that now you must look at the protocol rather than the presence or if they're a certificate ref set to determine what the story is for TLS for a listener. So I think that's probably one of the biggest changes. Is it will almost certainly, if you have been doing your processing in the way that I just said, you will need to add some extra stuff to handle the now possible case that someone wants TLS, but they don't have the certificate refs to handle it. So part of this will also we may need to add some extra conformance tests to sort of say, what do you do in this case, and make sure people set the conditions properly and all that sort of stuff for this to meet the release criteria. Because I know that for Cilium, our stuff won't handle this. And so having a conformance test that says what we should do will mean that, when we release 1.1, then, the conformance test will break and we will fix them and then we'll be good. Yeah. But I imagine we are not going to be the only people in that boat. And I guess the other thing that I want people to sort of think about when they're reviewing this, I don't see a better way. So, I'm not, I don't want to stop anything from happening, but using the TLS options, which is a map string, for handling this sort of information, makes me very uncomfortable because it feels like annotations all over again. And so I really want to make sure that we're all clear that if we're going to do this, we need to be very specific about what we allow and what we don't and how it works. And you can't just put any old thing in there and have it just work. We need to be specific about the structure here, or else it's going to get pissy very quickly. So yeah, those are the things that I'm worried about this. Again, Like the reason that I haven't been like, no, you can't do this, is because I can't think of anything better. Because I suspect there may not be anything better. We may need a sort of annotations like structure here to handle the wide range of stuff that people might want to do, but it still makes me uncomfortable because it's unstructured. And a large part of what we're trying to do here is to make sure things go in structured fields, not unstructured ones. And so, yeah, if anyone can think of a better way to do it, I'd be very interested. But in the absence of that, we need to put very clear rules about the unstructured things to impose some structure on the unstructured nature of it.
Yeah, I think those are great comments, great feedback. I will say that, yeah, the TLS options looks an awful lot like annotations, just in a different place. I'll agree with you. We actually copied the annotation validation verbatim when we pulled annotation when we created TLS options way back in the day. So yeah, I mean, at least we have that validation, and it's not just an empty map string, but it is very much going to have similar problems to what annotations do today. We do have some limits in place, but yeah, and this does try and provide some guidance on how to use them. But I don't love it either. I'm also in a similar boat, though, that it's hard to think of a better alternative here. So yeah, Candace, you've got some comments? I can't hear you if you are trying to talk, so you might be muted. Oh, can't unmute. Okay, we'll come back to you maybe. Yeah, it's too bad. Or if you want to drop something in chat, I can respond to that too. Whatever's best for you. Yeah, a couple other notes on this one. Oh, the host is not allowed. I can ask you to unmute. I don't know. I don't know. Any ideas, Nick, or anyone?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I hit the ask to unmute button already, but yeah, and I can't promote or anything either because of how the permissions work. Yeah, sorry, Candace, I don't know what. Yeah, if anyone else could anyone else, someone else who's muted, try to unmute and see if. Okay, thanks, Grant.
Yeah, weird. Okay.
Not working for you
Well,
either, Sanjay.
maybe try joining again or something. I don't know. If we find if you find a way to get back on, we'll revisit.
Okay, unmuting is working for Sanjay. Okay.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
All right.
Sorry,
Well, I'll
Candace.
come. Yeah, I think she may have left. Maybe she's coming back. So, all right.
Yeah.
We'll see. I'll take a quick detour then to the Get project board, and we can come back as needed to that one. So one of the things on the Get project board that is new-ish, sorry, my screen is not very wide right now, so you're going to have to use your imagination here, is there's a next transition column over here. And this is not a guarantee by any means. This is what I would call an aspirational column for each of these gaps. But this is kind of a follow-up from the conversation we had last time of gaps that we think probably belong in the next release to graduate to the next phase. So that includes session persistence and client cert verification as gaps that we hope are on track to make it to experimental in the coming release of 1.1. And that also includes conformance profiles, gRPC route, and route port matching as experimental gaps that we're hoping can move forward to standard gaps. If we get all that through, we probably have room for one other new experimental gap. I remember that we're trying to, leave room, so every gap we get out of experimental is basically a token or whatever that we can use to add a new experimental gap if we have kind of a fixed capacity there. And so some other ones that I know we talked about last time were retries, cores, and rate limiting. I'm not trying to put them in any particular order in terms of priority, anything like that. Just that these are features that we've talked about that have interest, that have existing issues. And so if these represent areas that people want to push forward, it's possible that they may make it to one of the last slots open for this coming release. Yeah, any comments, questions, concerns?
I feel like I should reiterate here that the intent behind having a limited number of things in experimental is where all of the discussion, like generally most of the discussion and sort of work happens, and where things are most likely to be the most contentious. And that's where it takes the most bandwidth for Rob, Shane, and I, and the other GEP reviewers. So the intent here is to just sort of limit the amount of things we need to be working on at once, so that we can actually keep things moving through. There's absolutely a designed-in friction here, in that we sort of want this to be a bit of a forcing function for people to be like, well, if you want your thing into experimental, you got to help us get something out of experimental, so that we can keep the velocity up and keep things actually moving through. Now that we've hit GA, there's a real risk that we're going to be swamped with, oh, it's GA, now I want my thing. And so the intent here is to sort of keep everyone focused on getting some things through the pipeline and actually graduating, so that we can keep our sort of overall feature velocity up. I would much rather that we just talk about whatever people are interested in, but practically we can't do that. Like, what's going to happen is your thing is going to get a couple of weeks of engagement and then go stale, because there won't be enough people to look at it. And I don't want that to happen to people's stuff either, once they put the hard work in to actually get us talking about something.
Yeah, for sure. And one thing I'll say here is all of these things that we're considering are issues and discussions that were started months or maybe years ago, depending on the feature. So it's good to have that kind of initial discussion of where would this fall, but like at a certain point we have that kind of fixed bandwidth, and we're trying to make sure that we don't overload experimental channel or try and take on too much at any one point. So this is our way of trying to rate limit, ironically, our incoming gaps. So yeah, good to see that, Mike, you've got interest in retries and rate limiting. Yeah, it seems like a lot of the community has a lot of interest in both of those features in particular. I'm hopeful that retries will be relatively straightforward, famous last words. And rate limiting, I'm less confident. There's a lot of complexity there, but I remember we had similar concerns about timeouts, and then after far too long of saying, "Oh, this is just way too difficult," Nick finally just took it on behalf of himself to just write it up and say, "Oh, we actually have overlap," and he made some awesome charts and diagrams to show the overlap across implementations, and hopefully there's similar overlap for rate limiting, but we'll see.
Yeah, so I think for all of these things, if anyone is interested in picking them up, for the record, for all of these things, the first thing for all three of those things, and auth as well, is to sort of do a roundup of what else is, of the different options in the field, what things are available, what prior art, and sort of talk about the different options, so that then we are all starting from the same place when you start reading the GEP. Like what I did with timeouts, sort of doing a review of all the major data planes and like what they do for timeouts, is sort of the right place to start. So for retries, for cores, for rate limiting, for auth, I know, for example, Envoy Gateway folks have implemented some rate limiting stuff already. That's awesome. Any gap that we do needs to sort of address the fact that that's already been done, and talk to folks about how that worked and what went well and what didn't, so that we can take what worked and what didn't there. Obviously, that's also Envoy specific, so we need to look at other data planes, how they do rate limiting, if what's the same and what's different, so that then we can try and find all the stuff that's the same, so that then we can make a portable configuration for rate limiting, for example. And so, but
Yeah.
you can't make portable stuff without having reviewed what else is available. Sorry, Mike, you go.
Oh yeah, all I was gonna say is I'll talk with Flynn a little bit about retries, where Linkerd specifically has like the bucketed style retries, which are different than like the static number of retries. So Envoy does support that in theory. So I think it's just a matter of reconciling like actual implementation support. I think Envoy Gateway has like work in progress to that. I think Istio potentially could implement something like that, the bucketed retry style. So then we have that plus the static one as basically two different ways to do retries in like extended conformance type stuff. So I've already started talking with Flynn a little bit about that. So have ideas and happy to collaborate with anyone that's interested in moving that forward.
Yep. Awesome. And I guess the other thing that's really relevant about the get board and experimental and stuff is we want this, we kind of need this to be a funnel. So like if you want to work on getting something into provisional, which is, again, the what, so not the what, but the why and the how, sorry, not the how, but like what and why, that review is sort of part of the what and why. So for retries, for those things, there's definitely space to sort of get a gap in that moves to provisional for those things with a much less bar, and that's not affected by the nothing more in experimental, right? Like getting something in that sort of lays out the ground rules for the discussion should be is good to do sort of sooner rather than later. That way we can show that yes, we are interested in it, yes, we do want to move this forward, the community is talking about it, and that means that everyone who's like, what is Gateway API going to do about rate limiting, we can say, look, there's a gap, it's in progress, we're talking about it, if you're interested, please come and talk more about it. And it gives people a central place to rally around, but more importantly, a central language to talk about things with. And so, yeah, don't feel shy to generate discussions that then turn into provisional gaps or a document, or any of the other ways that we sort of get the provisional process kicked off. Yeah, that's not affected by the, only so many things can move to experimental. So hopefully that's clear.
And then that was a good reminder that one of the things that we have as an opportunity for any new contributor or existing contributor is this route port matching gap. It is, I think, one of our most straightforward gaps, and it is on a clear path from experimental to standard. It just needs a bit of help to get there. And if anyone at all is interested in helping push that along, it's probably going to involve a bit of documentation and probably a few, well, maybe one more conformance test. I know we already have some conformance test coverage here. But yeah, anyone who's able to help push this along will help make room for another experimental gap. So feel free to either ping in chat here or on Slack afterwards if you're interested in helping out. Cool. All right, well, that's I think that's everything there. So let's move on. Grant, you've got some things to talk about on session persistence.
Yeah. Sorry for the wall of texts, but I had some thoughts that I had in a different document, and I figured I'd bring them here. So the goal is to really get the session persistence gap into implementable. So first, we have a couple questions that I need some help answering. So I'm gonna bring each meeting. I'll probably bring like one of these questions or topics to kind of move things along. And the first question I have here that I would like to try to get answered, or maybe not get answered, but also maybe you folks can point me in the right direction of how to answer the question. Is should we leave the room in this policy to add additional concepts in the future, such as session affinity? So if so, how will we adjust the naming and the overall scope of this policy? And you wrote that question, I think, Rob, or you.
Yeah, that sounds like something I would say. Yeah, I know that's something that I've been so concerned about too, because it seems, we don't want to have infinite policies here. We don't want to have a policy for every field, right? That's a pretty unfortunate outcome. And that is kind of the default path we go down if we take every tiny I'm not, to be clear, I'm not saying session persistence is a tiny feature, but if we take everything that can basically be represented with a single field or something like that, and call that a policy, then we've created policy explosion, which may end up being worse than annotation explosion that happened before. So that's my concern. And so, assuming we're heading down the path of a policy, which I think we are for session persistence, the question becomes, what else fits alongside that? This is one of the things that I think we struggled with backend TLS policy as an example of what belongs in the scope of this resource and what fits somewhere else. I think session persistence is, obviously one of the most requested features for Gateway API. So it's critical, but we just also need to think a little bit about what else could fit in that space. Don't need to solve all those questions now, but even if we just had a theoretical plan for, well, we think that session affinity, yeah, it could probably fit in the same policy, or maybe it can't, I don't know. And maybe this one other feature kind of fits in the same space. I don't know. I'm just kind of making things up as I go here. I'm not entirely sure what else fits well here, but I'd love to make sure we have an answer for that as we're pushing the SCEP forward. But yeah, Nick, go ahead.
So there's probably some crossover with some of the stuff that I'm working on with splitting up the policy attachment gap. One of the things that I think has come out of a backend TLS policy and some of the other policy stuff we're talking about is that I think that maybe we haven't gone far enough with the direct attach policy to make it clear that that is a single affected resource policy, and that as soon as that a policy that attaches directly to one resource affects resources other than the one that it attaches to, then it's kind of an inherited policy, even if you don't actually have inherited settings. So I think in terms of how that's relevant for this conversation, that I think if we wanted, one of the key things to think about here is where does the config need bind? Does it bind to a service or to a route? Do you have different configuration for the session persistence at the service or at the route? That is probably the critical decision, because if it's a service, then you're going to want a direct attach policy that binds to a service, very similar to backend TLS policy. And it's because in that case, the config is tightly bound to the underlying service. And in that case, it may make sense to move towards a load balancer policy with it being tightly scoped to load balancing stuff for that service. And that the reason that we have been pushing towards having sort of smaller policy objects is because when I tried to do back-end policy, which was way more generic than just TLS policy, it was too big, right? Because it had all of this stuff we're talking about with session persistence, load balancer algorithms, a bunch of other stuff that was too big. And back-end TLS policy was like the smallest unit so that we could get that through because there was a lot of other crossover. But this one feels like it could benefit from being slightly bigger, as long as the binding is very tight to the service. If you need to be able to specify this at the route level, then we have to have a different discussion. So Grant, sorry, you're unmuted if you want to respond. Now's your time.
Yeah, we've had a lot of discussion about route versus service. And the current prevailing thought is that we're going to try to do both of them, because unfortunately, I don't think Costin's here, but he was representing GKE Cloud Run, and I think his position was that they couldn't support service, I believe, or I guess it didn't make sense for them. I might have that flip-flopped, but it was one or the other. So we kind of landed on trying to support both of them, and that's actually another question that I have for another discussion, but sounds like it might be relative to this conversation.
Yeah, I think if I remember how that is today, and I very well could be wrong too, I think that many underlying implementations support attachment at service. That is the more common prior art, but at least today, Envoy it supports it at route level. And so there's a kind of fundamental difference in where, say, Nginx or HA proxy or others allow this to be attached versus what Envoy currently does. Please correct me if I'm wrong there, but that's how I remember this working and why it has been so complex to push through, because there are, even if the config is portable, where it attaches might not be here. Yeah, so I feel your frustration with this one. I really wanted to avoid a place where we were attaching in two different places, but I think I've largely been convinced that, maybe it is the least bad option we have here.
Yeah, so given that the rewrite that I am working on of sort of policy attachment and splitting it up into direct and inherited is probably going to be pretty relevant there, because the route one kind of feels like it's kind of inherited, because conceptually what you're doing is you're setting the load balancing policy at a per route level, and then however many backends you have in there, like, it applies to all of them in some way. So yeah, I don't know, like I need to think a little bit more about how I'm defining the direct attach, because I guess what I'm trying to say here is you should expect that when I do the direct attach one, it may tighten in a little bit to sort of focus in a bit more on what direct attach means, and it may sort of shrink the scope of what a direct attach policy can be, and other stuff will end up becoming kind of inherited as a result. I am sorry for that, but I think that it's the more that we can make the direct attach one smaller and sort of tighten the scope, the more it's going to be implementable in a wide range of ways, but it needs to be very tightly defined so that we can get that one done and then leave the sort of the inherited discussion for another time. If this turns out to be an inherited policy, this will probably be the first inherited policy that we include in upstream API, which will mean that we will need to be moving the inherited policy attachment API to graduate as we do this, in the same way that we're doing that with backend TLS policy. So yeah, like, Grant, I guess I will keep you posted on how the sort of separation work goes and get you to review with an eye to what you're thinking about with what looks likely here. And if I'm going to be stopping you from doing stuff you want to do, then that's relevant to know. But yeah, I'm trying to keep the policy attachment stuff relatively generic. But if I'm going to be stopping stuff that people are already doing or saying that that's no longer a valid policy, then I'm going to need to know. Yeah. So again, sorry for a tangent.
Okay, and the idea, the quick 2-second description of an inherited policy attachment, is that just that it propagates to more objects rather than just one?
Exactly. And so originally the idea was to have like defaults and overrides so you can mess with that. Yeah, and I want to time box this so that we're not talking about it much longer, but yes. So, but I think that is effectively what I'm thinking about changing as part of this, sort of making inherited policy a little bit more a little bit broader than it currently is. It's currently now inherited policy is only a policy that has a defaults and an override standard attached, and I think I made a mistake when I said that originally. And so I may have to re-edit what I previously said.
Okay. Rob.
Cool. All right. Yeah, I've got a hand here. I think I've lost track of this a little bit. Thank you to Grant and others for pushing this forward and bring it to the agenda. What can I do to help make sure this gets into 1.1? Like I know we kind of basically merged GEP as provisional. I think that's its current state, if I remember. But I think there were still some things that we had open questions about, and like what kind of, I guess this one that you're raising is a big one, but are there other ones? Should we maybe have like are there GitHub discussions, issues, PRs, whatever, where we can discuss this in more detail?
Yeah, that's what I was trying to work on, is sort of the forum to have these discussions, because I've got lots of questions. We can bring them up here. The other approach I was going to take was just start changing stuff in the PR and telling someone to look at it. So I do have a PR in draft that has some updates that could use a discussion. So that would be the other place we could put it. If not, if there's another tool like GitHub discussions or issues, I'm not using that at the moment, but please let me know if that would if that's useful.
Yeah, no, I think the draft PR is a good idea. I think you've also at some point you scheduled a meeting with the people that had been reviewing the session persistence PR or helping you with that. If there's a pretty, set group of people that are interested in this specific gap, maybe it's worth getting them all together again to just figure out what our path forward is here. It seems like we're awfully close. But that could be another option. But starting with a GitHub PR or something like that, just so we can get the high level ideas out there and kind of frame any discussion. If we get to a PR and everyone agrees with the proposal, then we're good. And if not, then maybe we need to, have some kind of longer discussion as a meeting or some other forum somehow.
Yeah, that sounds good. I did post about, hey, does anybody want to spin back up a working group? I didn't get much reply back. So I take that as either people are busy or maybe this is the best place to bring up topics about session persistence.
I think for things that you can easily time box or questions that you need sort of a short answer to, like I think this is a good spot to sort of ask the question and know that lots of people will see it, even if you then say, oh, this has gone longer than we thought, let's move it to a discussion on a PR or something like that. That makes sense. Feels like this is a good place to sort of bring up I suspect this has larger connotations style discussions, whereas the sort of the intimate details of the exactly how a policy is designed or something like that, like it's probably better for the PR. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. More generic, like this one's probably a good one for higher level architectural questions.
Yeah, I know. If you're having trouble finding anyone, I know there's a lot of interest in how this lands from Google's side, and I think you've already chatted with Gina, who's on this call, but she's been leading that from our side, and there are probably others as well that would be interested. So definitely, if you aren't getting any good feedback, please don't hesitate to ping myself, Gina, anyone. I know we're very invested in this succeeding.
Oh, yeah, I appreciate it.
Cool. Okay, well, I think that's everything there. Yeah, thank you so much for continuing to push that one forward, and I'm looking forward to getting this one actually out, hopefully in 1.1. Another open issue here, just moving on to triage. Again, I think I didn't mention it today, but same thing applies for every gateway meeting. This is an open agenda. Please feel free to add things to this meeting, future meetings, whatever. Try to get to everything, and I think we'll have plenty of time today if you have anything that isn't already on the agenda. Okay, so this one is Sanjay on the call? Maybe not today.
Yep.
But I think it's a good question anyway. The well-known CA certs field in backend TLS policy has, oh, you are, sorry, I missed you. Has a system value that I think may not make sense as core. Maybe you can explain this better than I can. I just wanted to make sure we talked about it today.
Yeah. So the backend TLS policy has a couple ways for specifying like where the CA certs to validate the connection from on the gateway side come from. So you can specify a secret. I guess the core resource is a config map with a certain data field. Or you can say that the secrets come from a well-known place. and that that is defined by the well-known CA certs field, and the current only like valid value is like the system. So it's kind of saying like you're going to use the system CA certs. So it looks like that was marked as core, though in the GEP, the language around this field uses the phrase implementation dependent and whatnot. I would just personally thinking about this field from a like conformance tests perspective, and like using the like how this would actually appear to the user, like it seems like this is kind of perfect for implementation as an implementation specific field, just because it kind of depends on the runtime environment of whatever data plane or controller that you're running in. We don't really, it's kind of hard to say that every implementation is going to provide the same certificate, you know? So just from the perspective of conformance testing, like it would be hard to write a test that says that a specific cert is present in the in what is like verified by the gateway, and also just from a practical perspective, like for the users, like what CA is going to validate that the server cert is the right one is kind of, it's not going to be consistent between implementations necessarily. So John Howard, I think, replied kind of, there's a meta point around here, which is like, if a field is marked as core, is it required to have a conformance test? So that's maybe a secondary question for, but an interesting one as well. But I don't know, I would say personally, I would maybe not mark this field as core, just because the, yeah, it seems like there's going to be a different user experience depending on how an implementation uses this field.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right here. I like John's point here is a good one. Like we're kind of on the edge here between two different things, right? Like we want to say like everyone should support the idea of system and just use whatever system CAs you have, but at the same time, it's near impossible to write a conformance test for that because depends on the system, depends on the implementation, right? What is your default set of CA certs? I don't know. I don't want to require it to be something that's very much dependent on your implementation. So given that, I think that you're probably correct. We should move this to something like implementation specific, and that's not saying that, you know, similar to regex, we want as many people as possible to support it, but at the same time, we recognize that it's going to have different value or potentially different interpretation depending on the implementation. So I agree with what you're saying. I'll defer to anyone else on the call who might have a different opinion, but I think you're right, and I'd certainly be open to a PR to fix this.
Sweet. And yeah, and I think there's a question in the chat about what if there are no system certs. That's kind of an interesting one too, right? Like if there's nothing actually present in your implementation. So like, for example, I don't know, you could be running your data plane in a Scratch container or like a distro list with nothing in it. Now, if, yeah, as it's an interesting case there. How do you write a conformance test for that? You know, how do you say that you implement that field? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I feel like the idea of system certs is if there are no certs on the system, then there are no certs on the system, and that's what you signed up for.
Yeah.
And it's kind of stupid, but that I feel like is the correct interpretation. But that also means, yeah, you can't write conformance tests for it. So
And yeah, I don't know if we want to go into the kind of the meta question there about conformance and core fields or not, if we want to take time for other things, but
I think there are probably some core fields out there that just are not viable to write conformance tests for, but they would have to be the exception rather than like I'm having trouble thinking of what that is, to be honest, but I feel like it must exist somewhere. But in general, I think our default opinion should be if you can't write conformance tests for it, you really should question if it's core. There may be times we answer that, yes, it's core, but we can't test it because of this weird reason. But I think the default is usually core means conformance test should be possible.
Candace,
Candace?
you want to try?
Hey, yeah, I figured out I figured it out. There was a dialogue open, letting me know that the I don't know, the translation service or something was on it. I hadn't pressed OK on that, so I couldn't press anything else while that was
Oh
open.
no.
Anyways, I probably need to update my Zoom. This is the only meeting I have that uses Zoom, so I just had a question about this. Is there some other way? I mean, I agree that I agree with the premise, but is there some other way that we can mark a field that, it has to, it has to be there. It's a part of a condition that we either have to have system or the other field to be there if you want to use this. But I mean, I don't know how to express this. We want to mark it core in a way that one of those has to be there if you want to use it. But we don't want to have to mark it core in such a way that we need to be able to write a conformance test for it for all implementations that may do it in their own specific way. So
Is that like in the
yes.
API, like in this the validation for the type, you're saying like you have to either specify what is it, well-known CA certs or the CA cert secret field,
Yes.
because otherwise backend TLS doesn't work. You're not doing anything. But
Yes.
well-known CA certs system field isn't necessarily required to be implemented. Like you can still say, I only support the.
So the validation says you have to pick one of them, but the system field is extended. Is the sort of that sounds like the or implementation specific. So we can say the validation can reference an implementation specific field. But the field itself support for it can be implementation specific. Does that make sense? Would that make sense, Candace? Does that sound about right?
Is it possible for us
set one or the
to
other.
describe it? Is it possible for us to describe it using the terminology that we already have, or not really?
I think so. Like I think so. As long as we have, if we say you must specify one of these two fields, we have places where we specify that, and that's usually done in the validation, in addition to in the
that is
and
there.
say one of the fields is implementation specific though. That makes sense, right? Like that fits with everything we have already. Like you have to specify one of the fields, but maybe your implementation doesn't support one of them, and that means that if your implementation doesn't support well-known CA certs, that's okay. Your implementation will reject it and put something on the policy to say that it's rejecting it. Something like that. That seems like a reasonably clear, in the same way that you would if it was extended.
Yeah, I think you're.
Yeah, sorry, you go.
Sorry, I think I agree with that general assessment there, that we need to provide guidance that to support this policy, you need to support this concept, right? Or alternatively, you can reject everything that has this policy attached because you can't support the policy. Those are your options.
So looking at that, the Go doc there, probably we need a small change to it where it says in the second paragraph, if CA cert refs is empty or unspecified, the configuration for well-known certs must be honored instead. And so we need to add something that says if well-known certs is if well-known certs is supported, right? Like and that basically means that if you don't support well-known certs, then you have to discard anything that does not have CA cert refs set, right? Like that's the outcome that we want to have here. And with the specification also saying, if you discard a backend TLS policy because you don't support something, here's what you do. You set this condition, you know, here's how you tell people that that backend TLS policy will not work with your implementation.
Yeah. That
Is-
makes sense to me. Or,
And
sorry, go ahead,
does,
Candace.
and does that follow through for conformance tests?
Yes, it will be if the field is implementation specific, then it does not require conformance tests. That's how we've defined the support levels at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah. And so like the shortest possible version I can say that in is the thing that differentiates implementation specific and extended is whether or not there are conformance tests. So extended means it's optional, but there are conformance tests. Implementation specific means it's optional, do what you want to some extent. And core is, it is not optional and there are conformance tests.
And the
Got it.
field being implementation specific, I feel like, I don't know if this is just me, but I feel like people are worried that implementation specific fields are not important, or they're not going to be implemented, or they're not
Yeah,
valuable parts of the API. But I feel like it's the opposite, right? Like if you have a field, if we're putting the effort in to add a field in the API, like it's important and people should implement it, but it's just that we can't guarantee that everyone implements it the same way.
this is
Exactly.
certainly the first time we've had a required implementation specific field. I think we should try and make it very clear that it is still required to understand this field, but we understand that the implementation details may be different. To respond to Arco's question in chat, extended is we recognize not everyone will be able to support a feature, but when they do, it needs to be in a consistent way. So you can have conformance test there. That's kind of like the whole support features thing. Whereas this, we're saying, basically you have to support this feature, but we can't conformance test it because we recognize that it's going to be different for implementation. And even maybe different variations depending on how the implementation is deployed. Arco?
Yeah, but I think you should still be able to reach a well-known website, right? Which is a backend, and add a conformance test for that. And some implementations may be able to support that.
So adding a conformance test though, the problem is that some in that case, so the conformance test needs to be, how do you reach the backend website when you have the thing set to system, right? Like that's the, if you set this to system, what is the behavior, right? Like, and so if I mean, we need conformance tests for this whole thing. And if we can write a conformance test for how the well-known CA cert system thing works, and expect that it will work on like at least some implementations, then sure, it can move to extended. But in the absence of a conformance test, it can't. It needs to be implementation specific. But you need to have a conformance test that tests that specific field with that specific set of config, right? Like, and it needs to very clearly test that, and so that we can do all of the extended stuff and have the feature and so people can mark down the supported feature and do all of those things and be confident that no matter how your thing works, if it supports it, it does do it in the same way. I mean, in the same way, is actually not that complicated, I don't think, in this case, in that the fact is, in the same way means it works at all. Like, the connection works. But yeah, so I think that's cool, but like we can't do that without the conformance tests, and I don't think we should block the initial implementation of this on having conformance tests for that, right? Like, so we need to have the conformance test for the bits that are core, for backend TLS policy, with the reminder that backend TLS policy itself is currently extended. So for an object that is extended that has core fields, the way that it works is if you support the object, you must do the core things, and you optionally may do the extended things. So it's like an option within an option, right? And so I think it's fine for us to launch this with that field set to implementation specific support. And then later on, if we have conformance test added, then we promote it. like that is the intended flow for implementation specific fields, is that if we can write an extended a conformance test for it, we promote it straight to extended, no problem.
That makes sense. Yeah. Thanks, Nick.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd say it would be conceptually difficult to write a conformance test with just, well, yeah, I don't want to open that can of worms, but basically you'd need
let's not.
a valid cert from a well-known CA, like, and you need to embed that somewhere in our, not saying it's impossible, it'd be very challenging. And then you're ruling out images that are built without system CA, CA certs in there. I don't know. Not impossible, but yeah. But I think we have agreement, consensus on our next step. Anyone want to volunteer to take this one across the line and actually update the spec?
Yeah, I can do it. Since I brought it
Sweet.
up.
Thanks. And then the last one, I know we're basically at time, but this is just an FYI. I'm happy with this and I'm about to LGTM it myself, but I would really appreciate if somebody else took a look as well. Mattia's done some awesome work on a revamp to how conformance reports are specified. There's a couple changes in here. One of them is there's a new README file that includes how you can reproduce the, basically steps that were taken to run the conformance test and how anyone else could do that. And then similarly, there's some high-level information that allows you to specify multiple reports per mode of your, so on GK, we have like, I don't know, 6 different gateway classes. This will be really helpful for us. I imagine there are other implementations this could help as well. So this, if you have submitted any conformance reports or plan to, this would be worth a review just to make sure that these changes line up with something that works with your system. Otherwise, I expect it'll merge sometime this week. Yeah, that's all I've got. Thank you everyone for discussion, and we'll talk to y'all next week. Have a great one.